life, sickness, old age and death, those kind of themes, often the theme of much poetry. But and the answers he found. And then we were looking at the presentation of the answers the Buddha found following his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in terms of the 3 signs of being and the 4 noble truths. And we'll look a bit more at the 4 noble truths this week. We did a kind of a brief overview, and then we looked at the 7-point meditation posture and did a guided meditation on shamatha on the breath. Yeah, shamatha on the breath meditation. So this time we'll start with the motivation. On page 27 here. Do that, then we'll do a short meditation, again, shamatha on the breath. And then we'll have a look at an overview of mind in Tibetan Buddhism. And then, sort of as I said last week, we'll also look at what it means to be a Buddhist, how Buddhists self-identify with the refuge or lines of safe direction, how they view inner being and the 4 seals of Buddhism, and do a little bit more about the role of motivation and dedication, have a look at the Noble Eightfold Path, then we can do a little bit more about the 4 Noble Truths, and we'll do another guided meditation, but because we're kind of focusing on the mind, we'll move from shamatha on the breath to the clarity of consciousness. Yeah, is that okay? So that's where we're going. So, were you here last week? Yeah. Good, I think I remember, yeah. And you were, I can remember, yeah. So I was just really explaining where we'd got to for someone who wasn't here last week, and then into what we're going to do this week. Okay, so if we go to page 27 in here, we'll do the same as last week. This is if you're unsure about reciting the refuge lines, you can just listen. If you want to join in, please feel free to do so. I'll lead the chanting of the transliterated Tibetan, which is on the left-hand side of the page, and then the English translation after that, which is on the right-hand side of the page. And as we're focusing a bit more on the role of motivation and dedication, we could actually do that now. In Buddhist practice, there's usually the preliminary, if you like, of setting up a motivation for the practice, setting your own motivation for the practice. And as this is Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism, what's called the refuge lines, the refuge and bodhicitta lines of taking safe direction and generating bodhicitta, are a Mahayana, classic Mahayana Buddhist motivation, because the principal aim of the motivation is, whereas you could say a classic, very generalized Buddhist motivation would be to seek liberation from cyclic existence or samsara and gain full enlightenment. That would be the kind of the aim or the objective. What makes it specifically a Mahayana motivation is doing that, saying we wish to gain liberation from cyclic existence and realize complete enlightenment, not just for ourselves alone, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. The altruism of the motivation, which makes it a Mahayana Buddhist practice. And the universal altruism is encapsulated in the generation of the bodhicitta part of the motivation. So bodhi in Sanskrit is awake or awakened, and chitta is mind. So it's the awakened or the awakening mind generating that one. And in the Mahayana tradition, that's synonymous with making a deep wish to be liberated from samsara and to gain full enlightenment, not just for oneself alone, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. However, if at this stage you're saying, well, that's interesting, but I want to think some more about it, then you can still use this time to generate a motivation, i.e. just bring your own highest motivation to your thoughts and to think, why did you come? What is it you're looking to get out of it? And to what end? To what benefit? And think about that for yourself in the context of what we're doing. But if you're happy, or maybe you've already taken refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, then you can just join in. Is that everybody happy with that? Any questions about motivation or what motivation is about? Or is it kind of clear? Huh?
What would an example be of motivation that wasn't cosmic?
Well, you could, for example, just take safe direction from the Buddha as the founder. Sort of recognize, acknowledge, pay homage to the Buddha, and as the founder of the teaching, as the Buddha of our era, saying that you wish to take refuge and safe direction from the Buddha, whether that's as the historical Buddha or our own ultimate enlightenment in the form of fully realized Buddha nature, and then taking safe direction from what's regarded as the real source of refuge, the Dharma itself, the teaching of the Buddha, and indeed all the Buddhas, and then the Sangha, which in the classic sense are all those who've gone to full enlightenment, but in the wider sense, those who've also liberated from samsara, the ordained monks and nuns, yogis, yoginis, and indeed anybody else following the same path, who would kind of act as spiritual friends and companions rather than hinder us on the path, and stop there. Why? Because we are seeking liberation from samsara and ultimately the realization of full enlightenment for ourselves to become Buddhas. You could leave it there. But what makes the Mahayana, or the great vehicle, different or unique in that respect is that it is, in a very explicit way, saying the reason we want to do this, the reason we want to gain enlightenment, is not just for ourselves alone, but for the benefit of all sentient beings, so that an altruism that's universal in scope is added to or provides a further motivation for wishing to gain liberation from cyclic existence and full enlightenment. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah, you could just be taking refuge or safe direction in the three jewels, wishing for liberation and full enlightenment, and leave it there. But if you're saying what's different about the Mahayana? Indeed, the Mahayana is path or vehicle, and Maha in Sanskrit is great. Yeah. So what's great about it? The great, what's great or big or huge about it is the vast scope of its altruism. Yeah. So that's what makes it classically Mahayana. Okay, shall we do the lines? Was there a question over there? Did you? Were you all right? Okay. Sangye chodang soke chonam la jangchu badu dakni kyapsu chi dage chunyen gipe sonam gi drola panchir sangye drupa jo sangye Chodang Soki Chonam La Jangchu Badu Dakni Kyapsu Shi Dage Chunyen Gipe Sonam Gi Drola Panchir Sange Drupajo Sange Chodang Soki Chonam La Jangchu Badu Dakni Kyapsu Shi Dage Chunyen Gipe Sonam Gi Drola Panchir Sange Drupajo. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create, through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Thank you very much. And then we'll do a little practice, study together, a little more practice, and then at the end we'll dedicate the benefits of the practice. So the practice is kind of bookended, if you like, or topped and tailed by motivation at the beginning and dedication of the merits at the end. And again, the dedication of the merits is a way of turning over, giving away, letting go of whatever benefit you feel that you've got for the benefit of something or someone else other and greater than oneself. And the classic dedication we'll use here is one that the awakened mind should arise in those minds where it's not arisen, and where it has arisen, increase further and further rather than declining. And again, that's wishing that all sentient beings would be able to realize full enlightenment. And in dedicating the merits in that way, there's a cultivation of generosity. And that cultivation of generosity is the first perfection, dana paramita, of a bodhisattva on the path. So that's an excellent way of introducing the 6 paramitas or perfections of the bodhisattva path. And it also it's a spiritual benefit in cultivating those qualities. It also has a psychological benefit in that by giving it away, we're letting go of any preciousness or piousness we might have around that. I've got this, I'm better than everybody else kind of feeling as a result of our practice. So, let's do a short meditation. We'll go back to where we finished last week, which was the meditation of bringing single-pointed mindful concentration to the breath in the body. So we bring our attention to the gates of the senses. Just simply bring your attention to the awareness that pervades what you can see, what you can hear, what you can smell, any residual tastes, and the totality of the field of bodily sensations. Not suppressing anything else, not pushing anything out of the way, letting everything go on just as it is. Not chasing after anything, looking here or there, but just gently bringing the attention back and paying attention to the awareness that pervades our experience of the 5 senses here and now in this posture. Relaxing into the posture as much as possible, letting go of any tensions. Getting used to the rhythm again of bringing the attention back if it's distracted by any external stimuli. Just to simply pay attention to the fresh, clear immediacy of our experiences of the five senses. Still in body, speech and mind, with the senses vividly alive. Just resting there. Then see if you can expand the scope of your attention to include mental consciousness. Just for a moment, pay particular attention to mental consciousness. Like a sixth sense in Buddhism. Propositional thoughts, strings of dialogue, big background emotions, positive, negative, neutral. Sense of past, present, future. Processing stuff almost involuntarily. Stuff that happened earlier in the day, earlier in the week. Maybe bigger and deeper things. Hopes, fears, expectations. Whatever's going on here and now. And processing about the future, whatever it is. What we're doing after the class, where we're going tomorrow. How close we are to the end of the week, whatever it is. Processing. Past, present and future. Try to refrain from doing it actively, but you might still be aware of it taking place automatically. Thoughts just pop up. Things running in the background. Undercurrent thought. Images. Reveries, daydreams. Just become aware. Don't try to modify anything. Don't try to correct anything. Just pay attention to the awareness that pervades mental consciousness. and the experience of the other five senses. What we can see, hear, smell, taste, and the totality of the field of sensations. Then drop down into the body, narrow the scope of your attention, leaving everything else to go on just as it is, but by choice, choosing to narrow the scope of the attention and just pay attention to the awareness that's pervading the totality of bodily sensations. Temperature, different sensations on the surface of the skin where it's exposed to the air as opposed to being covered by different weights and textures of clothing. Different sensations where the body's in contact with the cushion, the floor, the chair. Those sensations different as whether we're feeling it through the hard, bony, skeletal structure or the musculature and soft tissue. Different sensations where the body's not directly supported, not in contact with or rooted in the earth. Other surface sensations, numbnesses, tinglings, itches, muscular tensions, sensations from the structure of the posture, different where the body's dry as to moist, as to where there are spaces in the body as opposed to solidity. Sensations caused by the functioning of the vital organs, the pumping of the heart, circulation of the blood, digestive processes, the process of respiration, sensations of the breath, incoming and outgoing, ebbing and flowing like a wave-like rhythm within the totality of the ocean of physical sensations. And see if you can narrow the scope of your attention further by choice, not stopping anything else or repressing anything, but just by choice, narrowing the focus and putting your attention on the sensation in the body caused by the wave-like rhythm of the incoming and outgoing breath from the time it comes in through the nostrils, over the upper lip, up to the bridge of the nose, turns down the airways past the throat, upper chest, expansion and contraction of the lungs, working of the diaphragm, solar plexus, and gentle but subtle expansion and contraction of the abdominal wall. If you're distracted, just gently bring the attention back. Simply, gently. with open-hearted curiosity to the sensations of the breath in the body, brightening the awareness of those sensations on the in-breath, relaxing more profoundly into the posture and the practice on the out-breath. Just resting there, using the breath, the sensations of the breath in the body, as an anchor for undistracted, single-pointed, mindful attention. Using as little effort as you can. Relax more profoundly into the posture and the practice. Just rest there for a while in silence. Still in body, speech and mind. Alert with the senses vividly alive. Following the wave-like rhythm of the breath in the body. Any questions about the practice itself? single-pointed, mindful attention or concentration on the breath.
I have my leg, and I'm wondering, would I be better sitting on a chair or something?
Depends. The important thing is that the spine's straight, the body's erect, and that you're comfortable, yeah, and that the base of the posture is stable. So whether you do that by sitting on a chair or sitting on a cushion is really how you feel most comfortable. And you could theoretically do the same posture in Shavasana, laying flat on the floor. But there's a tendency when you do that to go to sleep if you're too comfortable. But it has the same effect, but then you certainly won't have any pressure or problems with the legs. So if you're sitting on a cushion, then you can sit with the legs crossed in the tailor's posture, which is kind of like that with the other one, yeah, like that, if that's not comfortable. Sometimes, see, you can play with that by bringing the spine forward on the cushion, the base of the spine forward on the cushion, and then see if the knees will go lower so they're actually on the floor. That's it. So you can play with that, or you can bring that leg in or out to get comfortable and stable. If you do that, you may also have to play a little with the height of the cushion, the idea being that the base of the spine is slightly higher than the knees, and ideally, the knees stable on the mat. If you're going to do the cross-legged posture, which is closer to where you are now, then it needs to be well balanced and stable. So if that's difficult, then you could do what you were doing, that's the Japanese style posture, kneeling onto, and then varying again the cushion height so that can become comfortable. But if the whole business of sitting on the floor is uncomfortable, then you can go back, sit on a chair, keep the feet flat on the floor, and sort of sit in the classic posture of the Egyptian gods. The important thing being statues of Egyptian gods have got like a very good sitting posture here. And the feet flat on the floor, the legs straight in front, and then the arms on the thighs or the knees, and then the back being straight, unless you've got a back problem, in which case use whatever lumbar support is necessary, but otherwise try and come away from the back of the chair and have the spine freely supporting the structure. But the important thing is that you're comfortable, because otherwise you're wrestling with the body, it's more like them being a hatha yoga class. You're trying to train the body and you're not going to have much attention left for meditation itself. So good to be comfortable. I mean, if you aspire to meditate in one of the yogic asanas of half lotus or full lotus, then train separately. So I'm going to do a bit of hatha yoga and learn properly how to do either a half lotus or a full lotus, and then when you can do that comfortably, then you can bring the meditation to it. But as we're not doing hatha yoga now, I would say find a really comfortable posture that you can do the meditation in. So is that helpful? Yeah? So we experiment and do whatever you feel best. Try not to be confined by ideas of yourself meditating, that it has to be in this posture or that posture or whatever. Kind of let go of that and think, how observing the basic principles of the posture, relaxed, upright, straight spine, kind of open at the chest, not too tight here, and a posture that's very, very stable, and you feel, I could sit here for 10 or 15 minutes, it's not problematic. Yeah, obviously if there's a numbness, or there's something not right about the posture, or it feels imbalanced, or there's some discomfort, then you just change or alter it. But the aim is to try and get to a posture that you're quite comfortable to sit in and don't feel a need to move. So if that's helpful. Any others on the meditation practice? Everybody happy with breathing, yeah? Okay. Then we'll move on and have a look at the main focus for this session is kind of having a look at the mind. It's kind of an overview of the mind in Buddhism, and maybe it'll be consistent with anything that you encounter in Buddhism in respect of the mind, but this presentation is particularly one that comes from Tibetan Buddhism, and probably there's a lot of very good, more academic, more psychological introductions, traditional ones, to the nature of the mind, but so that doesn't just become an academic or an intellectual understanding or get confused maybe with terminology and stuff we don't understand. It's quite good at it to just come at it from an experiential point of view so that you can actually have some experience of it. And in terms of the, if we're going to say, what are we pointing to? What are we trying to refer to when we talk about the mind? What are we talking about if we talk about mental qualities? So, how does the mind differ in that way from, when I refer to the mind, how does the mind differ from the bowl? Yeah. Well, the bowl is kind of made of something. It has a colour, it has a shape, it has a location, and it has certain qualities, quite cold to the touch, made of metal, and makes a nice sound if it's well made. Similarly with anything else we could point to, but when we refer to the mind, we're not at all sure that we're referring to a thing, are we? I mean, there is a certain thingness to that, but the mind doesn't have a shape, doesn't have a colour, doesn't have any solidity, doesn't have a fixed physical location. In fact, it doesn't seem to have hardly any of the attributes of any other material phenomena. So, classically, it's described as really having only three qualities in Buddhism. One is that it's empty, which will empty not in the sense of not having anything in it, empty in the Buddhist sense of not having any inherently existing essence, which we can come to further on. But for where we are now, beginning to look at the nature of the mind, most importantly, it's kind of clarity and knowing awareness. It's an awareness of experience and phenomena that is clear and also knowing, cognizant. And that clarity is the same even if we're kind of confused, even if we're hallucinating. We might be hallucinating and deluded, but it's still clear in the sense that the hallucination is very clear. Might even know that it's a hallucination, might not. So the clarity is still there. I mean, even if we're present, then when we're confused or sick or disorientated, we know it clearly. Yeah? There's a clarity to our perception that something's not quite right. In the same way, right now, everything hopefully is all right. And there's a clarity. Here we are, knowing where we are, in the room, present to the five senses. So there's something that can be said about the mind, even though it doesn't have a location, doesn't have a shape, doesn't have a colour, doesn't have any tangibility, i.e. it is not something behind my eyes, and it may not have any inherently existing essence. It's a ever-present, clear, knowing awareness. So that's probably the beginning of a description of the mind in Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. Is that any questions around that one? Are we kind of clear about that?
Yes, some people tend to think of the mind as being connected to the brain.
Connected?
Well, yeah, connected or the same.
Yeah. I think if you go back into the traditional presentations, particularly, it differs in different cultures, but in India and Tibet, so you might say in the Indo-Tibetan cultures, if you asked a Westerner, or maybe even a contemporary of any culture now, except for some, India, Tibet and a few others, and you said, where's the mind? They'd be doing this, because they've been taught that the mind is somehow connected or related to the brain. So they point here, but before there was that education coming from developments in neuroscience and cognitive science, they point here. Yeah? And also in the language, in the canonical languages, the mind and the heart are one. It's like heart-mind, same in Chinese. It's a heart-mind and you point here. So it's not felt as being located here. So we feel that it's located here largely because of a cultural conditioning. Yeah? It's kind of like that. We instinctively go here. I think partly because of the dominance of the sense of sight. So you kind of feel that you're somewhere here. But if you said, well, are you just your sense of sight? Then you might think, oh no, you might start feeling your feet and your legs and the sensation of sitting on the seat and say, it's not just about here, is it? It's my awareness, my consciousness, 360 degrees, made up of many components. It's just a kind of habituation that makes me see it here. And it's a cultural conditioning that makes me think, oh, it's in there. It's a kind of conceptual idea in the same way in the other culture. It's here. And the Sanskrit word chitta, which is translated as mind in English, if you look into the references and connotations of that word, it would actually sound a bit better in English, not perfect, but it would be more like conscious experience. And so our mind, our awareness, conscious experience, these are kind of synonymous. Which kind of gets away a bit from the idea that it is something in the brain. It's not to say that it's not challenging the scientific view that says there's a very strong correlation between brain states and mental states, between states of the brain and psychological states. Indeed, the research is very good. They can even know if someone has a stroke or suffers brain damage, which parts of their behaviours might be affected. There's also neuroplasticity of the brain, so if it loses functioning in one part, very often it can find new neural pathways and set them up again in another. And so that's fascinating, but nobody's ever, so far, and I probably think we can talk about it or discuss it, but I don't think it's logically possible to force an identity relation between the mind and the brain. So you can say that the mind, or this conscious, clear, knowing, conscious awareness, arises independent on a number of causes and conditions, of which brain states in a human being might be quite important, and there'll be a correlation between those states and the mind. It's not possible to reduce all talk about the mind to talk about brain states, or to explain our thoughts, significances, understandings, feelings, and other, what might be called mental qualia, by saying, oh, BS 60475, brain state 60475. So what does that mean? Oh, it means that the person's feeling very, very happy because they've received a reward. Okay, is that feeling of happiness one and the same as the brain state? By which means would you argue a relationship of identity? You can, the evidence is there for one of correlation, but not one of identity. You could be very, you could be very generous and say, maybe one day it'll be possible to do that. But I kind of contend logically, you're never going to be able to reduce talk of mental states to talk of brain states. Which kind of suggests to me that an identity relation is not really going to be possible. So the mind is not the brain. The clear, knowing awareness is not the brain. Yeah? And there's some interesting research that makes for interesting arguments in the sense of there was some research into a girl who had an MRI scan for other reasons, and they discovered that because of a birth abnormality, she only had half a brain, but she was far from being half a person. Her IQ was normal, her functioning was normal, and if she hadn't had the MRI scan, nobody would have known that she only had half a brain. So, anybody who wants to argue that the mind is the brain, the burden of proof is upon them to demonstrate it, because there's a lot of evidence that would suggest it may not be like that. It's convenient because of the dependence of mental states and consciousness upon the functioning of the brain and the central nervous system, because of course it goes down in the spinal cortex, doesn't it? Right down to the central spinal channel, and then the nervous system permeates the body. And there's recently good research that's saying there's quite a lot of neurons buzzing around in the gut. So it's interesting the way we are conditioned to think that the mind is the brain, or kind of resides there in some way, when of course there's no real evidence that it does. All we've got is evidence that clearly there's a strong relationship between brain states and states of consciousness. Any other thoughts about it?
I'm just thinking if someone suffering from Alzheimer's disease, could also have that knowing awareness, but it might not be.
Yeah, I mean, that's that's certainly true. I mean, my father, in his 80s, had a late developing Alzheimer's disease, and as that was developing, he was fully aware of what he was losing and what he was missing. He knew how he could get round it by putting lists on the fridge, organising his books in certain ways, doing things in certain ways, because he knew where the bits were, what was missing, had insight into his own condition in that way. And I think it's not until the condition becomes very severe and the brain's severely damaged that then you're in a situation where you can't really communicate properly, right? And whatever's happening, but it appears that the person's still conscious, still aware, even if they don't recognize you or have any strong sense of identity themselves. Yeah, yes, absolutely right. There is it's going back a little bit to what I was saying. You know, if we're confused or befuddled, or I suppose it's getting that time of year. You know, if we have too much to drink in the run-up to Christmas, you can know that you've had too much to drink, but you know that clearly. You think, oh dear, not going to drive like this, or better get home and go to bed, or whatever it is. You know what I mean? There's a clarity to that. Even if if I get the influenza, I'm laying in bed with a really, really high temperature, comatose. You know? I know that there's something in me that knows exactly where it is. It's experiencing those symptoms very clearly, and very clearly knows when the medication relieves them. So the kind of what that's dependent upon in the Buddhist account of the mind, there's kind of 6 main parts, you know, in the sense of 5 senses and mental consciousness, almost like a 6th sense, as we were saying in the meditation. So those are the kind of, and the awareness, the empty, clear, knowing awareness is awareness of something. Can't really have a consciousness or an awareness that's not aware of something. To be conscious of something, to think about something, it's an intentional thing. It has an object. Yeah? If I'm aware of something, what is it that I'm aware of? There is something for me to be aware of. Yeah? So a consciousness has an object, and the 5 senses, the sense organs, have objects. You know, objects of sight, objects of sound, smell, taste, touch. You do get interesting cases of kinesthesia and cross-central stuff, but by and large, I don't hear what I see, or see what I hear. So there are also objects that we're dealing with that are more orientated that way. You know, painting might be more visual, smell of the incense more olfactory, food more to do with taste and so on. So there's objects of the 5 senses, and then in a Buddhist presentation of the mind there are sense consciousnesses, i.e. that which is aware of what I see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and what goes on in mental consciousness. And there's an interesting thing to sort of consider, because you can experience it for yourself there. Probably sound, talking now, so there's vibrations going on in my vocal cords, because I'm wanting to tell you something about the nature of mind in Buddhism, as that's our topic. And you're hearing those sounds and interpreting my words, yeah? And understanding and following what I'm saying, or not understanding and asking a question. But just think about the sound alone for a moment. Is the sound in my larynx? Or is it in your head? Or if it isn't in either, where is it? Does the sound exist anywhere independently on its own? No, it's a phenomenon. I mean, it's a phenomenon that arises because I've got the ability to do this. The air can carry vibrations. You have equipment in your ear which can receive those vibrations, and then the vibrations somehow enter the nervous system and the brain. But the sound is not in my brain, is it? And if there were nobody to have no sentient beings with ears, then even if I'm doing this, would there be any sound? I doubt it. The sound arises in dependence on the totality of those causes and conditions. When we read a piece of paper, they're just sort of words and symbols printed on the page. What makes us be able to, once we've learned a language, be able to make sense of that? Where does that go on? Where does that actually exist or have a location? That's what I'm saying, in the sense of the mind's not having a location. There's also another aspect to that in terms of, here we are, the body can't go anywhere. It's really quite useful, it can't go anywhere else. If you want to come back to the present, you can always rely on the body, because it's here, it's always available. But of course the mind, it's a bit difficult for me now because I'm talking to you, so it requires a lot of concentration, but we all know I could get on a bus, somebody could be jogging me saying, "Roy, it's your stop." I might have been anywhere in time and space, completely oblivious to my surroundings, particularly if it's not very noisy. Mind can, I can think of friends in Australia or Canada. I can remember my journeys to the Taj Mahal or the Empire State Building. Right now, mind can go anywhere. It doesn't have limits in the same way. And also the distinction, the other one that's a very heavily conditioned one, inside and outside. It's a useful conventional distinction, but is there really any distinction? I mean, you're sitting over there, I can see you. Are you in my mind, or are you over there? Where's the appearance taking place? For me, or for you? It's happening. There's a clear, knowing awareness of all the objects and qualities of everything in the space that we can see. But where exactly is that taking place? Not really in here, not really out there. Because maybe the objective, subjective, in here, out there distinction is just one we make conventionally because it's useful. Because I can say, oh, this is out there, but my thought of an ice cream is in here. All I'm saying is my thought about the ice cream is, until I declare it to you, is private, whereas the bell's always public. No? Anyway, it's an interesting way to begin to think about the presentation of the mind in Buddhism, and to try and think out of the box a bit from our normal, habitual, conditioned kind of understanding. And some of that conditioning is kind of innate, just because we kind of feel that it's that way. And some of it's culturally acquired or acquired by education. And it might be very useful as a model, but is that the way it really is? If we mistake the map for the territory, not a very good idea, no? Could be a mistake. So, There's a nice piece by Lama Zopa, spiritual director of the FPMT. What is the mind? Mind has no colour, no shape, and no material substance. It's different from the body, which has colour and shape and is substantial. The basic definition of mind is, quotes, that which is clear and able to perceive objects. In other words, mind is a formless phenomenon that knows things. Clear doesn't necessarily mean that the way the mind sees an object accords with reality. It refers to both the hallucinated mind and the valid mind. Generally, the mind sees an object clearly. Whether the object is appearing rightly or wrongly, whether it's a false object or a true one. For example, from a distance, somebody in a department store might see a mannequin as a real person, because the shape and posture of the body are like those of a normal person. They give the label person to the mannequin because it has the shape of a person, and they then believe in the label. The mannequin then appears to them as a real person, even though in reality there's no actual person there. It's simply a mannequin. First of all, the person sees the base, the shape of a human body. Because of that, they label person and believe in that label. It then appears to them as a person. Even though that appearance is not true, it is a clear appearance to the mind. Objects do not appear clearly to the body. Clear has to do with perception, and perception has to do with the mind. Appearance is a production or creation of the mind. Rocks, trees, and other substantial things don't have perception, so nothing appears to them. It's only to the mind that things appear. The mind is divided into 6 primary minds, or consciousnesses: the mental consciousness and the 5 sense consciousnesses, consciousness of the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. The mental consciousness mainly discriminates the meaning of objects, whereas the senses mainly discriminate the qualities of objects. After our senses have had contact with something, after we've heard, seen, smelled, tasted, or touched something, and experienced some feeling from that contact, it is the mental consciousness that makes sense of the experience and remembers it. The mental consciousness allows us to reflect on what we did this morning, yesterday, last year, or since our birth. The mental consciousness, from a Buddhist point of view, is beginningless and endless, so therefore can continue from life to life. But the other 5 consciousnesses don't go from one life to another. Yeah? And there's also another important aspect to looking at the mind in Buddhism, and that's the mind itself, that empty, clear, knowing awareness, is seen as being diamond-like, adamantine, indestructible and unstainable. So whatever experience we have, happy or sad, indifferent, painful, pleasant, comes and goes, comes and goes, comes and goes, whatever experience it is, no matter how extreme in any direction. Those adventitious aspects are not staining in any way the purity of the mind. Yeah? It's the nature of the mind is pure. The nature of the mind is clear light, not mixed with ignorance. Even though we have ignorance, our minds are not mixed with ignorance. Even though we have attachment and anger, our mind are not one with attachment and anger. Our problem is that we obscure the pure nature of the mind by following selfish attitudes and wrong conceptions. These pollute the mind, not allowing us to develop its full potential. If you think back last week to the 3 signs of being, in which the Buddha's insight was that everything conditioned was unsatisfactory the word dukkha, suffering of the three kinds: gross physical suffering, suffering of change, and pervasive suffering. Then everything impermanent, nothing whatsoever lasts. And then finally, no permanent, unchanging, partless, existing from their own side, self-sufficient essences. Yeah. And the Four Noble Truths then brought the idea of the first noble truth being that very dukkha, or suffering, and the second one being, i.e., that's what's experienced, and there's a possibility to understand the origin of that. If you understand the origin of that, which is a kind of a fundamental ignorance, but not the ignorance of not being well educated or ill-mannered, the ignorantly assenting to things as they appear, rather than having an insight into the way they actually are. Yeah. This ignorance, avidya, is not seeing things the way they actually are, but believing they exist in the way that they appear. So if we think that, or kind of act as if things were everything fine, everything's all right, everything's okay, nothing changes, it's solid, it's concrete, and so on and so forth. We have attachments and aversions based on that kind of view or behaviour. And when it turns out not to be the case, we're very unhappy. When it is the case, then we're very happy. But then when we get what we don't want, we want what we do want, and nothing is permanent. So the dissatisfaction arises in that way. So all of that suffering and happiness, all of those feelings about our experience, are like the adventitious experiences that the clear, knowing awareness is aware of. But they're not one with the clear, knowing awareness. Clear, knowing awareness is free of sense. It's regarded as pure. Yeah? And in that sense, the business of the path, if you like, is one of purification. But here think about, if the water in the glass is, you put mud or dirt in the glass and you stir it up. It looks very murky and muddy, but if you leave it still for half an hour, it settles. And the water's clear. So if you like, that which was muddying the water's not affected by it. As we know, and think about what happens to the water that we're drinking from the tap every day, it's restored as all the things that have been through it. How many bodies it's been through in London before you get to drink it. And so on and so forth. Do you know what I mean? But those defilements, that contamination, which in one state means you can't drink it, are not the same as the water itself. The water always remains pure, yeah? So these experiences, experienced through the medium of an unenlightened or ignorant mind, are not the purity of the mind itself. So that's also an important part of the basic presentation of the mind in Buddhism. Lama Zopa again, no matter how strong our ignorance, anger, desire, self-cherishing and other delusions, no matter the negative karma we've created, these things are not permanent. All these obscurations are temporary. Like fog in the sky, they'll not always be there. They're dependent arisings. In dependence upon causes and conditions, fog is produced and obscures the sun or moon and the sky. Then in dependence on other causes and conditions, such as the wind, the fog goes away. It's the same with the dirty cloth. In dependence on causes and conditions, the cloth becomes dirty, and then in dependence upon other causes and conditions, the cloth can become clean. In dependence on soap and water, the dirt will go away. So one of the earliest and most well-known and most comprehensive manuals of meditation in Buddhism, going back to the Pali Canon, is called the Visuddhimagga by Buddhaghosa. Visuddhimagga, Purification. So meditation is a way of purifying the mind of those obscurations so that it rests in the natural state and we experience things as they are. It's kind of a central core of the Buddhist path. Any questions about that so far? Yeah.
The clear-light nature of the mind, the pure mind, or the mind that's free from all obscurations or minds, is that mind? Does that mind arise independence on anything, or does it like arise from its own knowingness or its own side or its own, like is it something that's produced from something else other than its own self or its own qualities?
Well, the fully enlightened mind, yes, is not born and doesn't die. It's uncreated. It's not. It neither exists nor not exist. Is not both or neither. Yeah? It's ineffable and beyond those dualistic qualifications from a Buddhist point of view. Yeah? And it's not a thing. It's empty, clear, and cognizant. Is that helpful? I mean, in a sense, what's being said here is that because they are conditioned, because they are impermanent, all these other things being referred to as the obscurations, everything which moves, yeah, is a come and go. Nothing lasts. But the medium or space in which that takes place is empty, clear, knowing. It's the stillness which pervades the movement, if you like.
Is it just attained through meditation?
Sorry?
Through meditation? Not being able to...
The goal of meditation is to realize the nature of the mind, rest in it and act out of it. Yeah. In that sense, when we're talking a little bit about what defines Buddhist, you remember last week we also, when we were talking about the 3 signs of being, we said the 3 signs of being become the 4 seals, that all conditioned things are unsatisfactory. They're unsatisfactory because they're impermanent, yeah, at every level. Nothing lasts. And they're impermanent because there's ceaseless change and there are no inherently existing entities or essences. And the cessation of the unsatisfactoriness is nirvana, or peace. I mean, nirvana means the cessation of suffering. Yeah? So those three signs of being become the four seals. So if you said, what defines a Buddhist, no matter where they come from, at what period of time, what school, what country or whatever, it would be that they'll all say, we agree the four seals, that all conditioned things, everything that's born and dies, everything that changes is unsatisfactory, that everything is, that there are no inherently existing essences, and the cessation of suffering is nirvana. That's peace. Yeah. So does that help answer? Or? Yeah, so to recognize, realize, and rest in that is the objective, and that is the result of what's being termed here purification. See, purification, again, the words are difficult, aren't they? Because when we normally think into a context in a Christian or maybe other Hebrew and Islamic and other cultures, it's about good and evil and purification of bad stuff, to get to good stuff. Whereas purification here means just clearing away the obscurations to the purity of the mind. Yeah. I think more of purification in a chemical or alchemical sense rather than a moral sense, yeah? Does that make sense? Or maybe some of the analogies and metaphors talk about the polishing of a mirror. There's dust on a mirror that occludes the image, but if you polish it, you can see clearly what it is. And also the analogy of the mirror is also very useful in terms of the mind, because of course what the mirror does is reflect whatever arises in it. Yeah? So the mirror of our awareness reflects whatever arises within its sphere. No? And the nature of the images we see are not unlike the images on the surface of a mirror. So, and also to, again, thinking and moving a bit more into what we were talking about, accepting the four seals being how a philosophical way of putting how Buddhists might self-identify themselves, that it would also be in terms of understanding this purity of the mind and the purification of the mind, which is telling you that there's nothing to search for out there. It's already here. Realizing enlightenment is not about realizing something that you don't have. And I suppose if you wanted to borrow from a Christian tradition, of heaven is within. It's already here. There is, within Buddhism, there's one school of thought that's actually saying, you're already enlightened, the problem is you don't realize it. There's nothing to be got out there. Or if you said to the Buddha, for example, go back to the very basic teachings of the Buddha, and you see yourself as impoverished or damaged, worthless person seeking to take out some course of training to, at some future date, realize enlightenment. The Buddha's going to say, there is no I, and would you want an enlightenment that can be attained? No. Why? Because if it can be attained, it can be lost. Whereas Nirvana, the cessation of suffering, is the cessation. There's no losing it. Realization of enlightenment is something that occurs here and now. No? This whole premise that there is an I to follow a Noble Eightfold Path and realize enlightenment at some future time is, again, a little to start to mistake the map for the territory. Yeah.
So if the mind is knowing and clear by its nature, what is it that's actually generating these obscurations, and what is it that's
What's generating?
the obscurations? What is it that's generating the things that are clouding it over, and the grasping of attachment?
Well, it's grasping at appearances that's causing the obscurations.
The mind is.
Yeah, there's a tendency, there's an innate tendency and a conditioned. It's in part innate and part conditioned, yes, to, as a result of past experience, yeah, we over-conquer, and the fundamental ignorance, if you like, we over-concretize our experience. We think it's more real than it actually is. We take it more seriously than it actually is. We regard it as being more concrete than it actually is. We start to engage with it as it appears, rather than thinking, how actually is it? It appears like that, but is it really like that? And as a result of that, we have attachments and aversions. We like this, we don't like that. Yeah? And we act according to those attachments and aversions, which are driven by past experiences. In the words of the Buddha, because of this, that. Because of this, that. If the causes and conditions come into being, then that will persist until the causes and conditions subside or no longer exist, cease to exist. So it's that grasping, craving, grasping, over-reification, attachment and aversion that is the source of the problem. If you like, that's part of the origin of suffering. If you go back to the traditional teachings, the origin of suffering is ignorance, greed, and hatred, or sometimes put as anger and hatred, similar. It depends the modality. But if we say ignorance, greed, and hatred, the ignorance of those three is the fundamental one. We know what sort of ignorance that is. Why is it more fundamental than the other two? Because it's on the basis of the ignorance that greed and attachment arise. If you saw things as they actually were, these two would not be there. They'd dissolve. They would cease. Yeah?
And it is the mind that has these delusions.
Yes, yeah, in that sense, the source of both samsara and nirvana is right here, right now. Yeah. It's why in Buddhism there's so much emphasis on. I mean, if you wanted to really get it simple, it's like, watch your mind. Be mindful. Yeah. Be present. So, if what is happening to me now is a result of experiences in the past, then what I'm going to experience in the future is going to be as a result of what I'm going to do now. No? What's happening now is conditioning my future, in the same way that what's happening now was conditioned by my past. Is that answering, yeah?
I think I forgot my question. So, yeah, I forgot my question.
Okay, well it's past. Maybe you'll remember next week. So what we'll do next week, there's a little bit left over. We'll start next week after the meditation with a study of the Eightfold Path, because we looked at the 3 signs of being and the 4 noble truths, and the 4th of those 4 noble truths is the path to the cessation of suffering. If you remember, the 4 noble truths were suffering, dukkha, the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path to the cessation of suffering. It's kind of deliberately set out not in cause and effect, but what are we experiencing? Unsatisfactoriness, suffering. So if we understand that, and understand that well enough, really understand it, not just intellectually understand it, then we're motivated to look for the cause. If we find the cause, we can bring about the cessation. How do we do that? By pursuing the Noble Eightfold Path. So next week we'll have a look at the Noble Eightfold Path. If you want to do any reading between now and then, have a look at some of the traditional explanations of the Noble Eightfold Path. I'll save the meditation for next week. So next week if for the rest of the time in between time, if you don't already have an established practice, carry on with mindfulness of breathing. And next week, by taking what we've been thinking about tonight into the meditation, we'll do a meditation on the clarity of consciousness or awareness. Yeah? Okay. We'll finish with a dedication, which is the one line in the back of the book. Jang chup sem churin pushe ma kyu panam kir gujing kir wanyam pa me payang gong ne gong du pelwa zhou. May the precious jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Thank you very much. Great to see you again. Stay well, go safe in the meantime, and see you next week. Actually, if you wanted to, you can take one of those, which is a kind of a sheet on the 4 Noble Truths, which we've covered so far, but it's a handy kind of thing to have if you want one. You can pass them around and give me the other one. And there is the meditation